Good morning, and it's another fine day, and I'm back here again to talk on a new issue. The last series um, was on science in the Bible. I was able to consider some of those issues, and today I want to talk again on an issue that is very important and is important to all of us, whether we believe in the Bible or not. And um, these are some of the things that the Bible talks about, but yet maybe does not put it in words. And we need to consider it in terms of the contemporary issues that are going on. And the topic is the rise of woke, focus on the causative paradigm. Now, most of us have heard about the woke movement. Actually, for me, it took a long time before I was able to really go and check what is this woke thing. And it's interesting that I was actually interacting with it uh, before I got to really understand it in terms of names or words. And it was something I had interacted with, and I really come to my own position on the issue. And I believe that today is important to really talk about this issue of woke. And it is not, most of the time, we are not doing this because we want to convince anybody. Um, the truth is that, as you would hear at the end of this message, is that the woke agenda is not an agenda that will easily go away. Now, one thing that you have to understand about the woke agenda is that Africa is a foundational source of the woke agenda. Now, it did not start as the woke agenda, and it had a very legitimate beginning. And of course, we know that Africa itself was uh, a place where that had, especially sub-Saharan Africa, had alienated itself from the rest of the world in search for independence, in search for peace, for a right to live their own life, devoid of the civilization that had begun to blossom in the Middle East, which North Africa was part of. And so Sub-Saharan Africa had alienated itself effectively. Other parts of the world that were also a bit different were South America, Australia, and some parts of Asia. Now, Asia can boast of being a part of the world that actually has an exclusive claim to its own identity. It was able to move away from the Middle Eastern human civilization, multiracial human civilization that have been created in the Middle East, and create its own structure, its own system, totally different from the rest of the world. Now, this was what was actually inherently supposed to happen in sub-Saharan Africa, but the Africans were more liberal. They wanted more independence and did not really get to the point to achieve that one mighty civilization like what the Chinese were able to do, what the Japanese were able to do at a point in time. So, for that reason, they did not interact with evolving technology as they should have. Technology that was freely available in the rest of the world. They did not really interact with it, and so you had a people that were intrinsically, for the most, weaker than the rest of the world, and thus fell to become victim of the transatlantic slave trade, which in itself began uh, some hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade, due to the Roman conquest and all that. But Sub-Saharan Africa was really effective in defending against the Roman conquest. But some parts of had because of the war itself, introduced the black man to the rest of the world, and because of that, that slowly initiated later on the transatlantic slave trade. So, because of that, after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, uh, the Africans that were in other parts of the world, of course, were fighting against slavery, had won the fight against slavery. The rest of the world, Britain in leadership, had colonized much of Britain, France, and the rest of some of those European countries, colonized much of the African continent. And from the 40s into the 50s and 60s, there was this move for independence. Now, these are the original beginnings of the woke movement. But it was intrinsically totally different from the woke movement. This was Pan Africanism at its beginnings. Now, the Africans, sub Saharan Africans, who had generally rejected the education and the civilization that was nurtured in the Middle East, now were forced to accept what was now called Western education, and this helped them to now express themselves as to what they really wanted. That sense of independence, that sense of individual culture, which they wanted to proliferate. So it began actually as a very legitimate claim. Uh, they were emancipated from the system they had rejected, their own kings and oligarchs that were mainly based in North Africa, in Ethiopia, the Sudan, and in those areas, the Nubians and the Ethiopians mainly. They were some of the oligarchies that had led Africa. A few were also found their way into West Africa, into South Africa. But these were the ones that the world mostly knew. And the most of sub-Saharan leadership had stood their ground, though networking with those oligarchs, for their own independence. And so did not accommodate, did not accept the technology, the exchange of ideas that were coming from the Middle East, some from Europe, some from Africa itself. And so at the end of the day, this was the only opportunity for them to express themselves. English culture, French culture, Portuguese culture, to express themselves. This came as a desire for independence and Pan Africanism. So this now continued to evolve right into the 80s. One of the popular movements is the Arusha Declaration, which was clearly put out. And this was an original African desire for Africans to govern themselves the way Africans want to be governed. And other parts of Africa could not create such a movement like in Nigeria. Nigeria was kind of slow in catching up. Of course, the desire for independence led by Nnamdi Azikiwe, Herbert Macaulay, and the rest of them, was also genuine in its own sense, but really did not have the urgency to Africanize. So different parts of Africa had different needs, and so the movement could not grow in the way it should have. And of course, in Nigeria, it was slow and did not mature until the early late 90s. where Africans became tired. We're tired of the World Bank. We're tired of neo-colonialism, and we want to have a country that we ourselves will decide what we want. Even though they were independent, they knew they were not really fully independent in that sense, and they wanted real independence. And this is where the sense of Africanism began in the real sense in Nigeria. And you can talk about the Ghana, the experience in Ghana. Experience in Ghana was led by Kwame Nkrumah, but of course it was short lived, and people like later on, people like Rawlings took over that had probably more of a Western agenda. I don't know, but some people feel he had more of a Western agenda. So there were expressions. Some people look, we must express ourselves properly and implement it properly, like in the Arusha Declaration, or we accept the British form of leadership. And those were the arguments, and that was why military rule kind of proliferated in Africa. And this was the issue in Africa. This was the beginnings of woke, the desire for independence. And while same movements were going on in the United States, especially, of course, all around the world, but in the United States especially, these people kind of got, you know, to begin to discover their African heritage. You know, oh yeah, we are really Africans. They came back to Africa, saw some of them liked what they saw, uh, of course, and those movements kind of interacted and slowly gave birth to what we have today as the woke agenda. And the woke agenda itself has a legitimacy in that sense, and we want to look at the illegitimacy of the woke agenda also because of the incompatibility of some of the systems that came together. It created an illegitimacy. And uh, to look at this properly, we have to also see some of the things that actually created the woke agenda. And one of those things is that early on, the system that was supposed to help Africa failed, at least in the where it found its origin, and that is in the uh, Soviet Union. Communism. Communism fell in the Soviet Union. Communism was influential in coming into Ethiopia, in coming into Tanzania, in coming into a lot of the more uh, early civilizations in Africa, uh, especially in Ethiopia that had claimed never to be colonized. You know, to kind of help Africa because Africa could be actually identify with communism as a system because that was what uh, similar to what the Ethiopians practiced, ruling most of Africa. What the Sudanese Nubians practiced, ruling most of Africa. And so they could really identify with this. And while trying to, interact with this, as time went on, communism did not really succeed in planting roots in Africa. And, subsequently it fell even in the Soviet Union. And of course, where even in China, where it still is, it is not really the original form of communism that should have been. And so it lost, the power to assert itself. And because of that, this confusion came up and created, what we have now as the woke agenda. The woke agenda itself is a form of socialism, a movement to assert some form of socialism. And because of the failure of communism, it created a new communism, a desire to compensate, because capitalism itself is really a system that not all human beings can really identify with, because it is fast, it is built for those who are excited about life, excited about creativity, excited about free will. Yeah, and not everybody can resonate with these ideas. And strangely enough, the woke agenda claims to want to bring back some of those ideals, free will and all that. So you wonder where the incompatibility is coming from. And the answer is simple. Most of those who practice this wokeism are not really uh, conscious of what is really going on in the world. And why is this? Because there is a discovery. When you look at it, you discover that the those who patronize the system, those who are beneficiaries of the wealthy, are those who are woke. And this is the irony. And so there's this article I read in a magazine called Trumpet Magazine, written by the Philadelphia Church of God. Church of God, if you might know them, you might not know them. But they featured an article called Why Are the Wealthy Woke? And apart from the fall of communism, the other problem that complicates the woke movement is that the wealthy too are woke. And why are they woke? For the very same reason which created the struggle for independence, the rise of the woke movement. They want to sell their products. They want to remain rich. And so to remain at the top, they have to please those who are at the bottom. And so the irony comes that those people who claim to be fighting for freedom, who claim to be fighting for independence, are themselves the beneficiaries of the very thing that creates the societal imbalance. First of all, they cannot live without some of the benefits of technology. They cannot live, you know, I want to let me quickly refer to the transatlantic slave trade. What created the transatlantic slave trade was a desire to produce goods for the industrial revolution. Cotton, trade in cotton, the textile industry. And so slaves were brought in mass to farm those fields and to provide raw material for the textile industry. And so the desire to live comfortably, wear clothes, for advancement. Once the poor cannot do without these good things of life, you know, of course, they are beneficiaries of the very suppression they claim to be fighting against. And if they do not have a solution, a better solution, they remain subject to that very system. And that is what we see in the very woke agenda. The wealthy are woke too, because they're smart guys, of course. They don't want to, they know uh, uh, how the system works. They need workers for the system. They know that if the system collapses, they will also not benefit, and so they must try to balance out uh, this problem.